I was there at Alesia. Not many left can say that now. Not many who still draw breath anyway. Most of the men I stood beside, ate with, marched with, bled with, lie buried in that foreign earth, beneath the gray skies of Gaul. Some are in shallow graves, others in none at all, their bones tangled in the roots of that cursed hill, picked clean by wolves and time. But I remember. By the gods, I remember it all. The war did not begin at Alesia. No, that was where it ended, where Gaul finally broke beneath the weight of Roman discipline. But the beginning, that was months earlier, when snow still crusted the passes of the Alps and the wind tasted of frost. I remember standing on watch at the gates of the winter camp in Cisalpine Gaul, just outside Mutina, when word came from the south. A rider, nearly dead from the road, delivered the message. Revolt! The Gauls had risen. Again. But this time, it was different. They had a leader. A true leader. Vercingetorix, king of the Arverni. Not some tribal chief with more pride than sense. No, this one was clever, dangerous, and worst of all, unifying. We had crushed Gaul, or so we thought. One tribe at a time, divide and conquer. That had always been the way. But now they were coming together. Bituriges, Carnutes, Parisi, even the Belgae. Tribes that had fought one another for generations now raised the same banner. The threat was real. And Caesar, our imperator, our hammer of the north, was in Rome. Still tangled in the endless politics of the Senate. But he held command over 3 provinces, Gallia Narbonensis, Illyricum, and our own Cisalpine Gaul. That meant power. That meant men. 4 legions were under his immediate command, though by campaign's end, more than 10 would march beneath his banners. I remember the day he returned. A sudden stir through camp. Trumpets, hooves, the bark of orders. I stood at the entrance of his tent, one of the guards assigned to his personal detail, a position of quiet trust. That day, I saw him ride in, cloaked in crimson, his eyes hard with purpose. No greetings, no formalities, just a nod to his aides and a barked order to prepare for the march. He was always like that in war, sharp as an arrow, cutting through delay and indecision. There were whispers that he had ridden day and night from Rome, that he'd skipped the comforts of Provincia, stopping only to secure supply routes and meet with loyal tribes. Within days, we were moving north, to Agedincum, to war. On the second night of preparations, I was stationed just outside Caesar's command tent, spear in hand, eyes scanning the dark. The scent of damp canvas and firewood lingered in the air. Inside, a map was unrolled on a broad wooden table, held down at the corners with iron weights. I was not meant to hear, but the flaps of the tent shifted slightly in the wind, and I could see shadows cast by the lamplight. Caesar stood at the head of the table, one hand braced on the wood, the other gesturing over the terrain drawn there. Around him stood his top officers, Labienus, Trebonius, Crassus, Antony, veterans all, faces weathered, cloaks damp from travel. "We do not go straight to Gergovia," Caesar said, voice low but firm. "Vercingetorix expects that. He wants us desperate, marching fast and starving. We will not give him the pleasure." He moved a token across the map, tapping 3 points as he did. "We strike here, here, and here, Oppida with stockpiles, not just to deny the enemy, but to feed our own. This is not conquest. This is survival. Every town we take, every..." Labienus nodded. "And the roads?" "Guarded, carefully. We will leave no garrisons behind. If we march like ghosts, we will reach the Boii before Vercingetorix knows we've slipped past him." There was silence for a moment. Then Trebonius spoke. "And if the enemy turns on our tail?" Caesar looked up, and the lamplight caught the sharpness in his eyes. Then we turn and cut off the head. That was the strategy. Not speed, but misdirection. Not brute force, but precision. He dismissed them shortly after, and they left the tent in grim silence. Plans etched into their minds, orders to be passed. He stepped outside a moment later and caught me watching. "You heard?" he asked, not accusingly. I nodded once. "Then be ready," he said, "and keep your men ready. The next few weeks will decide the fate of Gaul." And then he was gone into the night, like Mars himself, walking among us. He did not take the direct road. That would have been suicide. Instead, we moved like a blade through soft flesh, curved, deliberate, deadly. Each captured oppidum meant food, tools, shelter. We took what we needed, left nothing behind. Vercingetorix had besieged Gergovia, a city loyal to Rome and home to the Boii. He meant to crush their spirit and show others what came of allegiance to Caesar. One night, as I returned from patrol, a scout galloped into camp, mud-slick and panting, his cloak torn from riding hard. He brought word that the Gauls were pulling back, retreating from the siege at Gergovia. I remember the way my heart swelled, hearing it. Not just because of what it meant strategically, but because the Gauls, proud and defiant, had fled at the very whisper of Caesar's advance. I told my men as we stood by the fires, and for a moment we all shared the same silent pride. The glory of Rome still held weight, and the tribes still feared the eagle's shadow. But we knew better than to think fear alone would win this war. But that did not mean he was defeated. He changed his tactics. No more frontal assaults or open battle. He would burn the land behind him, starve us out, and harass our scouts and foragers until our strength bled into the soil. And it nearly worked. The further we marched, the worse it became. Ashes lined the roads. The trees stood like blackened skeletons. Whole villages, gone. Their grain stores emptied or destroyed. Wells fouled. Animals slaughtered or driven into the hills. We ate hardtack softened in rainwater, when we had it. Men whispered in the dark that Caesar had miscalculated, that we'd marched into a wasteland. Our stomachs grew tight. Our strength waned. The food we'd hoped to find at Gergovia was gone with the Gauls' retreat. A few more weeks of that, and we would have had to turn back, or die where we stood. Hunger gnawed at discipline. It was the quiet enemy, the one that never showed its face in battle. And yet, it killed all the same. Then word came that Avaricum still stood, untouched, defiant, and foolishly full of food, a gleaming target amid a sea of ruin. We marched past ash and smoke, farms, fields, entire villages burned to cinders by their own people. It was like chasing ghosts. No battle lines, no grand confrontations, just cold, hunger, and constant threat. He kept his strongest positions intact, though, fortresses of stone and wood. Avaricum was one of them, rich, fat, defended by rivers and pride. Vercingetorix advised abandoning it, but the Bituriges Cubi wouldn't hear of it. Fools. Caesar convened his commanders under a pale gray sky, the cold wind whipping at our cloaks. I stood just beyond the ring of officers, close enough to hear. He pointed to the map with his dagger. "We take Avaricum," he said, voice hard as stone. "Not for pride, for survival. Our men cannot fight on empty stomachs. The Bituriges will not flee, so we make their defiance their doom." There were murmurs. The city was well defended, natural barriers, strong walls. But Caesar would not be swayed. "We cannot afford patience. We starve or we strike." So we laid siege. The cold was bitter. The winds turned every uncovered inch of skin raw. I led my contubernium, 8 men under my command. We were veterans, most of us. some from Spain, some from the east. We built towers, dug trenches, stood watch in shifts so long they blurred into eternity. They taunted us from the walls, arrows, stones, fire. We lost men to disease and exposure. But the works rose, day by day. Then came the assault. It was my century on the wall when the order came. The horn sounded, a deep braying note that cut through the dawn mist, and I shouted the call. But I wasn't meant to stay behind the wall that day. I led the charge from the tower itself. Our siege engine lurched forward, groaning on its heavy wheels as the ground beneath it churned into mud. I stood at the front, shield raised, gladius drawn, my contubernium packed in behind me. The rain soaked through the seams of our helmets, plastered our cloaks to our backs, but we said nothing. Only the creak of timber and the steady heartbeat in our ears. Ballistae fired in synchronized volleys, each shot whistling over our heads and slamming into the enemy walls with bone-jarring cracks. The sky turned black with a swarm of missiles, arrows, javelins, stones from our torsion engines. It was as if Jupiter himself hurled thunderbolts into the heart of the enemy. I felt the heat rise, not from any fire, but from within. Despite the cold, despite the downpour that soaked us to the bone, my blood burned in my veins. This was it, the moment we lived for. I looked back at my contubernium, saw the familiar faces, Lucullus, silent and steady as ever, gripping his scutum like it was part of his arm. Marcellus, muttering prayers to Mars under his breath. Gaius grinning, that madman grin he wore before every battle. We all nodded, no words, just readiness. As the army reached the base of the wall, ladders went up. The towers met stone. Grappling hooks clinked against timber. And then, chaos. The Gauls fought like cornered wolves, desperate and furious. But we were the hammer. We reached a breach in the upper parapet, where defenders had been cleared by a volley of pila and a scorpion bolt that shattered the wooden barricade. I climbed first, dragging myself over the jagged stone with grit in my teeth and rain in my eyes. Behind me, Lucullus hauled up the standard, the proud insignia of Legio Ex Equestris, a bronze bull rearing on a crimson field, glinting in the rain like a god of old, and planted it high upon the battlement as the rest of our centuria poured in. The moment the standard stood, a cheer went up, raw, triumphant, unrelenting. The first upon the wall. I felt a surge then, not of pride, but of something heavier. I looked down from our position, and in the gloom below, I saw the gate crumble, a great crashing of wood and flame. And through the smoke, like a tide of bronze and red, the Roman line surged forward. The breach had been made. From above, it was a terrible beauty. The precision, the discipline, the fury. Our comrades flooded in, shields raised, blades ready. The proud Gauls, once lords of their land, were now scattered like chaff before the wind. I felt something twist in my chest. They were brave, fierce, but they had risen against Rome. This was their reward. The noise was deafening. Screams, metal on metal, the low chant of Roman battle cries. I saw a Gaul charging toward me, painted in blue woad, eyes wide. I met his axe with my shield, drove my gladius under his ribs. Another came, then another. It was blood and mud, fire and steel. It was war. We surged forward. Inside was chaos. The Gauls fought, but it was hopeless. Some tried to flee, some begged, others stood and died. I saw one of my men, Secundus, a wiry lad from Capua, take a spear to the gut and fall. I carried him out after, bleeding, half-conscious. He lived, but many did not. 40,000 Gauls died, some warriors, some not. It wasn't clean, but it was necessary, or so we told ourselves. The city gave us what we needed: grain, furs, rest, and time. 3 days after the battle, when the dead were still being counted and the wounded groaned in rows beneath awnings, a formal assembly was called before the remnants of Avaricum Square. The standard of the 10th stood tall beside Caesar himself, planted firmly in the ground, mud still clinging to its base. He called forth names: centurions, soldiers, engineers, men who had earned distinction, and then my name. Decanus of the 10th, Caesar said, his voice carrying over the crowd. First on the wall, first to plant the standard of the bull. I stepped forward, the sounds of battle still echoing in my ears. My knees ached. My arm throbbed from where a shield blow had numbed the muscle. But I stood straight. A soldier brought forth a small, gleaming circlet, a golden crown embossed with walls and towers. The corona muralis. It was placed in my hands, and for a moment, all was still. I thought of my men, of Lucullus, Marcellus, Gaius, of Secundus, who would not walk for weeks, of those who would never rise again. I accepted the crown with a bowed head, the cheers of the legion ringing in my ears. And then Caesar did something more. "You fought like a centurion," he said. "Now lead as one." He named me to command the century, ours, the same that had lost its officer in the breach. The words struck like thunder. A promotion, not just of rank, but of weight. I was no longer merely a decanus. I was now responsible for the lives of a full 100 men. It was the highest honor I'd ever known. But even as I stood there, the corona muralis gleaming in my hands, my thoughts were not on myself. I looked to my brothers in the crowd, mud-smeared, scarred, tired, and I made a decision. I would sell the crown, melt it down if need be, divide the coin among my contubernium, those who had climbed with me, raised the bull standard with me, fought with me, for we had done it together. Glory is best when it is shared, and no gold in Rome could ever shine brighter than what we had earned side by side. But the war was far from over. Even in defeat, Vercingetorix held his coalition. He was bloodied, yes, but not broken. In fact, the fall of Avaricum seemed only to deepen his resolve, and that of his allies. The tribes still stood with him, and worse, others began to join. The Aedui turned next. Once proud allies of Rome, their druids and tribal chiefs still spoke the words of loyalty, even as their warriors armed themselves for rebellion. We had marched beside them, shared grain and oaths, but their loyalty had always been bought with Roman favor and fear. With Vercingetorix rising and the fires of resistance burning hotter, many among the Aedui began to see Caesar as a fading shadow. They feared what Rome would demand when this was over: taxes, laws, garrisons, and they longed for the old ways, for their own gods and councils, to rule without Latin tongues dictating their fate. Some believed Vercingetorix could win. Others simply saw which way the wind was blowing. They chose rebellion, not because they hated us, but because they feared they had more to lose by staying loyal. In their eyes, Rome brought roads, laws, and chains. Their betrayal struck deep, not just politically but practically. With their lands now hostile, our supply lines thinned to a thread. What grain we had flowed like water through a sieve. Whispers of hunger returned to the campfires. Men looked to Caesar, not for orders, but for reassurance. So he looked beyond the borders of Gaul. He sent riders east, across the Rhine, and gold flowed with them. In return came the Germans. They were not like us. Tall, broad-shouldered, wild-eyed, clad in furs and wielding long spears. They spoke a tongue that growled like thunder and laughed like wolves. But they could ride. By the gods, they could ride. Our cavalry had been worn thin by ambushes and attrition, but these mercenaries answered with terrifying efficiency. They did not fight for Rome, they fought for silver. But in that moment, they were what we needed. They were the storm that rode ahead of us, the shield to our flanks, the fang in our line, and for a time, they kept us alive. The Germans, unburdened by Roman discipline or restraint, overtook retreating bands of Gauls and slaughtered them without mercy, taking what they could carry: grain, livestock, tools. No order was given. It was simply the way they fought. A dirty way of war, perhaps, but necessary. Their spoils fed the legions, and for those of us who had gone days with little more than scraps, that brutality tasted like survival. After Avaricum, Caesar turned toward the Aedui to settle their divided leadership, tribal squabbles that threatened to open more fractures in our alliances. For me, the march north was different. I was no longer just another soldier. I was a centurion now. I walked among officers, dined at the fringes of command, gave orders that carried more weight than they once did. I felt the eyes of my men differently, hopeful, expectant. I would not fail them. It was in the Aeduan camp that I first heard the rumor. Whispers drifting between tents, of shifting allegiances, of rival chiefs and druids at odds. By the time we arrived, tension hung in the air like smoke. The Aedui, cloaked in fine wool, faces painted with pride and suspicion, stood beside their tribal fires and watched us carefully. Caesar called a council. I was posted as part of the outer guard, but I moved closer, just far enough to see and hear. The tribal elders had gathered, broad-bearded men with heavy torques at their necks, and druids with eyes like polished obsidian. Caesar stood before them, calm as stone. He spoke through an interpreter, but the weight in his voice carried plainly. "Choose your leader," he said. "End this strife, or Rome will end it for you." There were raised voices, then silence. A name was spoken. A rival bowed his head, and just like that, a fire smothered. For now. As I entered the command tent for a bit of fortified warm wine, the scent of spiced steam curling in the air, I noticed a cluster of senior officers gathered around a campaign map. Scrolls were unfurled across the table, tokens placed and moved, voices low and purposeful. I was just lifting the cup when Caesar's aide spotted me and beckoned me closer. I set the wine down, approached, and saluted. "You've served the 10th well," he said. "Pass this to your men. Labienus rides north." I summoned my century that night. Lanterns burned low as I addressed them beneath canvas and stars. "Labienus will march with 4 legions to face the Senones and the Parisii," I told them. "We stay with Caesar. Our path lies south, straight to Gergovia." Labienus, bold, broad of shoulder, fierce of eye, one of Caesar's oldest companions, a man with dust of every campaign in his cloak folds. If Caesar was Rome's hand, Labienus was her drawn sword. The next morning, we watched them go. 4 legions in perfect column, the rhythmic stamp of Gallic beating like war drums on the packed earth. Standards were raised high, eagles gleaming gold in the pale morning sun. The wind caught the banners, crimson, blue, deep green, each marked with the proud emblems of Rome's might, fluttering like the breath of the gods. Wheels groaned beneath the weight of siege engines and baggage carts, iron rims slicing tracks into the soft spring soil. A forest of spears stretched into the haze, the shafts swaying in perfect unison with every step. Shield faces glinted beneath their covers, rows tight, discipline absolute. It was a living wall of war, precise and unyielding. I stood with my men, silent, watching them vanish into the rolling mist, our brothers, our mirror. And then we turned our gaze south, toward Gergovia. It stood like a challenge from the gods, perched atop a high plateau, steep cliffs on all sides, its back protected by the central massif, its gaze cast across the wide valleys of Arverni land. Gergovia was the heart of Vercingetorix's people, a place of tradition, power, and pride. And it was there he chose to make his stand. We marched along the Alaver, hugging the right bank, while Vercingetorix mirrored us on the far side, destroying bridges behind him to slow our crossing. But Caesar was too clever for that. One night, under cover of mist and pine, he feigned retreat and then doubled back. We rebuilt a bridge where the Gauls thought none would be, and crossed the river before they knew we were gone. That maneuver forced the Gauls to pull back toward their stronghold. And so, 5 days after the crossing, we stood before the great oppidum of Gergovia. It towered nearly 800 meters above sea level, the ground rising sharply beneath it. The slopes were unforgiving, particularly on the north and east. From below, it looked impossible. And maybe it was. We built our camp on the southeastern approach and, as always, set to work fortifying. Ditches, ramparts, patrol lines. Then, with iron discipline and quiet precision, we seized a neighboring hill, La Roche Blanche, cutting the Gauls off from a portion of their access to fresh water and food. That blow alone might have broken a lesser enemy. But Vercingetorix saw the move for what it was. He quickly built a second wall, reinforcing the saddle that connected the western rise to the main plateau. If we were to advance, we would have to take that approach head-on. The days crawled by in wary silence, interrupted only by the occasional skirmish or cavalry raid. Caesar wanted to draw the Gauls into a mistake. He had done it before, and from our high ground, he believed we could choke the city, cut it off, starve it, break its will. But Gergovia was no ordinary city, and its people were not ready to fall. That was where it all came to a head. That was where the true test began. For more stories, like and subscribe.
Legionary, Part 2. Gergovia, Historical Context. It is the year 52 before the birth of Christ. Gaul, a vast land of forests, rivers, and proud, warring tribes, has risen in revolt against Roman rule. United under the banner of a single chieftain, Vercingetorix of the Arverni, Gaul's once fractured tribes have forged a coalition to cast off the eagle standard of Rome. It is a rebellion not of one tribe, but many. Bituriges, Parisi, Carnutes, Aedui, Zenones, united in cause, if not in blood. Opposing them stands Gaius Julius Caesar, proconsul of Cisalpine and Transalpine Gaul, governor of Illyricum, conqueror, general, and political master. For 6 years he has campaigned across Gaul, subduing tribe after tribe. But now the war has changed. Before the march on Gergovia, the Caesar had divided his forces. He sent Titus Labienus, his most trusted legate, north with 4 legions and half the cavalry to subdue the Senones and the Parisii, who had begun to rise with the rebellion. Caesar himself advanced with 6 legions toward the Arverni capital. This bold division of strength stretched Roman lines and set the stage for the bitter siege that followed. We follow one soldier, Titus Cassius Scaeva, a centurion of the 10th Legion, veteran of Hispania, son of a Marian soldier, hardened by 15 years of blood and discipline. Last we left him, he and his men had arrived before the great hill fort of Gergovia. where the might of Rome would be proven, against walls, warriors, and the fury of a land that refused to kneel. What follows is his account of strength, of command, and of Rome's triumph over chaos. Our camp at Gergovia simmered like a held breath. We had taken a hill called La Roche Blanche days earlier, severing part of the Gauls' access to water and grazing land. And in answer, Vercingetorix had thrown up a second wall, a new fortification across the western saddle, shielding the only viable approach to the city. We knew what that meant. Battle was coming. It hung in the air like thunder that never cracked. I stood outside my tent, arms crossed, helmet tucked under one elbow, watching the ridgelines in the distance. The sun had yet to rise, but already the camp was stirring, sentries shifting in formation, messengers flitting like wasps between the command tents. Drusus, my optio, joined me. He didn't salute. He never did when no one else was watching. But he gave the report straight. They've tightened the line overnight. Pullo saw 3 fresh watchfires on the slope. Either they're reinforcing, or they want us to think they are. Either way, I said, they're expecting something. He grunted. That meant agreement. Tension rippled through the ranks, a cold determination that Roman discipline would prevail, shaped by countless drills and tested in many battles. Even Lupus, who usually met mornings with curses and boasts, was silent as he checked his squad's pila, his expression calm, focused. The men weren't afraid. They were poised, disciplined, like a drawn bow held steady, ready to spring into action. This was the 10th. We had trained for this moment 100 times before. We would not falter, not here, not with Caesar watching. This battle would be won. Rome did not send her legions to fail. I made the rounds, checked with Crispus, one of my decani, a wiry veteran from Campania, with a soldier's gait and a farmer's patience. He'd been with me since Hispania, through the dust of the Ebro and the mud of the Loire. The men trusted him, and so did I, shared nods with the other centurions. And all the while, I watched the hill. The order came at midday. A feint. Caesar's intent was not to storm the city outright, but to probe its defenses, light palisades, trenches, and that new stone-reinforced wall atop the western saddle meant to block any serious Roman advance. He hoped to draw the Gauls into confusion or misstep. 3 cohorts, nearly 1,200 men, would advance, press the enemy's western line, then pull back. My century was among the reserves, ready to support if needed. I formed my men with care, shields firm, lines tight. We stood in full formation, just behind the forward slope. I glanced at Drusus beside me and muttered, "Seems the glory goes to others today." Drusus didn't miss a beat. "Let them have it," he said. "We'll be the ones they call when things go wrong." I smirked. He wasn't wrong. Still, I took pride in the sight of them, 80 men, armored and disciplined, standing beneath the standard of the 10th like the killing machine they were trained to be. One of my men muttered something about how the real fight was happening uphill. Another snapped at him to keep his sword sharp and his mouth shut. Even my optio cracked the ghost of a smile. Then came the horns, a triple blast, long and sharp. The signal to advance, but only for the forward line. The forward line stepped off in good order, their movement crisp, ranks tight. From my position on the reserve slope, I watched with pride as Roman steel glinted in the sun, and the discipline of the legions unfolded like clockwork. Then I saw it. One cohort broke from formation, not all at once, but staggered, like a ripple-turned wave. They didn't advance. They charged. "What are they doing?" I barked, turning to Drusus. "That's not the signal. That's not the gods' damned order." He was already shouting, even before I gave the command. "Standard bearer, forward, shields up, on me." The Gauls saw it too, and reacted with terrifying speed. From their breastworks, they unleashed a storm. Arrows and slingstones peppered the advancing cohorts as they neared the palisade, the sound of impact like hail on bronze. From my position, I saw the men hesitate, formation faltering under the rain of missiles. The Gauls poured forward in answer, bursting from the defenses in a surge of spears and savage cries. I watched it unfold even as I gave the order to advance. The line broke. What had begun as a proud Roman march became a staggered crawl, then confusion, then collapse. I saw shields tilt back, backs turn, officers shouting to regroup. We had seconds to reach them before the Gauls overran the breach. A rout was forming. And that's when I gave the order. "Form up! Advance by line! Lock shields! Keep the line! If they break through us, they'll roll up the whole flank. We hold, or we die." Drusus relayed it down the line without hesitation. My standard rose. My century moved. We slammed into the gap the charging cohort had left. Plug in the breach before the Gauls could pour through it. Some of the men from that cohort had turned and were scrambling back down the slope. Many were already dead. A few reached us, faces bloodied, shields lost. But these were the most glorious moments of that cursed day, when Mars himself stood with us. My century held, shoulder to shoulder, as the storm closed around us. We planted ourselves like iron into the breach, facing wave after wave of Gallic warriors, determined to shatter what discipline remained. We held with every ounce of training, every curse we could summon, every memory of those who had bled beside us in campaigns past. Behind us, the battered remnants of the routed cohort scrambled back into formation. I caught glimpses through the press, men gripping pilums with blood-slicked hands, centurions barking orders, standards rising anew through smoke and dust. We gave them time, by the gods. We bought them that time with our own blood and breath. The Gauls, emboldened by the Roman retreat, came farther and harder than expected. They hurled javelins and curses, trying to break through before our comrades could recover. We stood firm. We were the 10th. When the cohort reformed and rejoined the line, we began a slow, brutal withdrawal. Step by step, shield to shield. It was a retreat, fought like a campaign, but we bled for every pace. By the end, over 700 of our brothers lay dead across the slope. We had failed, but we had not broken, and we had not shamed the eagle. Caesar called for a full withdrawal. Trumpet signaled the fallback, and our lines disengaged under cover of the remaining reserves. I remembered the sound of it. Metal dragging over stone, groans of the wounded, the sharp commands of centurions rallying their men as we fell back across the ridges. The Gauls pursued only so far, harrying our rear with arrows and jeers, before retreating to their walls. That night our camp was quiet, too quiet. I walked the lines in silence, passing fires where no one spoke. We had taken the worst loss since the war began. Caesar summoned the officers before dawn. He stood wrapped in his cloak, hair still damp with sweat and mist, his eyes set like stone. No blame passed his lips, no excuses, only orders. "We move at first light. This is not our ground." And just like that, Gergovia was behind us. We had not broken, but the rebellion had gained something we hadn't seen before. Hope.
For more stories, like and subscribe.
Act 2. Turning the Tide. After Gergovia, we marched with weight in our hearts, but not in flight. Caesar's will pressed us forward like the hand of Jupiter himself. Yet not 2 weeks along the Loire, word came like a javelin to the gut. The Aedui, Rome's trusted allies, or so we thought, had turned. Not in some quiet rebellion or whisper of discontent. No, they struck with precision. They seized Noviodunum. But it wasn't just a town. It was our lifeline. I remember the exact moment the courier arrived. His mount foam-lathered, his eyes hollow with fatigue. The scroll he handed to Caesar was sealed in red wax, but the way his hand trembled told us enough. I stood with Drusus not 20 paces from the general's tent as Caesar read it, his lips tight, the color in his face turning colder by the second. Your Noviodunum held everything: the treasury, our grain reserves, the hostages of conquered tribes, children and chieftains alike, given as oaths of loyalty. I'd fought beside Aeduan auxiliaries, shared campfires with their scouts, watched them pledge themselves to Caesar, and now they had thrown it all away. Years of alliance shattered for a single grasp at Gallic glory, and we, the 10th, were marching deeper into a land that no longer knew the meaning of Roman friendship. That night, I couldn't sleep. The men around me stirred with unease. Even Pullo, usually all grins and swagger, was quiet. I sat sharpening my gladius by firelight. I found myself wondering what kind of people change allegiance with the wind. These Gauls, fierce in battle, proud in defiance, yet their loyalty meant nothing. One day, swearing oaths to Rome, the next, raising arms against us. Was this the nature of a people without law, without discipline? They called it freedom. I called it chaos. And chaos had no place under the eagle. It wasn't just betrayal. It was insult. And I knew Caesar would answer it not with words, but with steel. I remember the silence that fell when word reached the command tent. Caesar said nothing at first, but his officers did. Retreat, some urged. Fall back to Narbonensis, preserve what remains, resupply, strike again when the legions are stronger. It made sense, tactically. The war, they argued, was lost for now. A withdrawal south could buy us time. But Caesar refused. To retreat would mean forfeiting everything we had taken in 6 years of blood and conquest. Worse, it would abandon Labienus, still fighting near Lutetia, to his fate. The Cevenna Mountains made any safe retreat near impossible. Jagged ridges, snow even in spring. And most of all, it would embolden Vercingetorix and spread the rebellion like wildfire. Caesar rejected the proposal without hesitation. "We do not yield Gaul," he said, "not to treachery." So we turned north. We marched hard into Aeduan lands. No siege engines, no delays. This was not a campaign of conquest. It was a campaign of retribution. Every town that barred its gates met Roman steel. We breached palisades with axes and torches. Those who resisted were struck down. Their chiefs, if captured, were tried swiftly and hung where their people could see. Grain stores were seized, shrines desecrated, and roads cleared by fire. There was no pity in it, only purpose. These tribes had chosen to betray Rome, to trade law and order for chaos and pride. They had broken faith, and so they were broken in turn. We needed to send a message. To remind Gaul what happens when you raise your hand against the eagle. It was Roman discipline writ in flame and steel. The legions moved with brutal efficiency. My century took 3 villages in as many days. Crispus joked we were marching faster backward through friendly territory than we ever did forward into enemy land. At dawn, a courier arrived. Dust-caked, he bore grim tidings. Labienus had failed to take Lutetia and withdrawn to Agendicum. Street fighting had cost him dearly. He had saved the legions, but barely. I stood behind Caesar as he read the scroll. His face gave nothing away. Only when he finished did he speak. We go to him. Orders flew like lightning. Within an hour, we were on the road again, leaving the ruins of Aeduan loyalty behind us. We marched fast and hard, crossing the Loire under clouded skies. Every man knew we were walking into danger, but we also knew we never leave our own. We met Labienus in the heart of Gaul, at Agendicum. His legions were battered, his men hollow-eyed, but they stood. And with that reunion, the Roman army was whole again. Meanwhile, Vercingetorix moved just as swiftly. In Bibracte, he gathered all who still opposed us. He was crowned High Commander of the Gallic peoples. Tribes pledged warriors, 15,000 in all. They would scorch the fields, destroy their own villages, and deny us every resource. And then they would strike at Narbonensis. The command tent was already thick with tension when the scout arrived. Mud-caked, panting, one arm wrapped in a bloodied sling. He didn't even wait to be announced, just pushed past the guards and dropped to one knee before Caesar. Narbonensis, sir. They're moving against it. Vercingetorix has sent riders, orders for every tribe south of the Loire. They mean to break the province. The silence that followed could have broken a lesser man. I was there, standing near the back with Drusus. Around us, the senior officers exchanged looks. Even Labienus had gone quiet. Caesar stepped forward slowly, took the scroll from the scout's trembling hands. His eyes swept across it. No change in his face, not a flicker. Then he spoke. Lucius commands 22 cohorts, too few. He looked up, his voice cut like a gladius. We move south at once. No argument, no debate. The meeting dissolved into motion, officers barking orders, aides racing for the maps. Drusus and I followed Caesar out into the night air. He said nothing more, but I could feel it. The iron behind his silence. Treachery had lit the fire. Now Caesar meant to stamp it out. So we turned again, this time to the south. Vercingetorix shadowed us, waiting for weakness. And when we reached the highlands of the Lingonese, he pounced. The first scream came from the rear. I was riding beside Drusus near the center of the column when the dust plume rose behind us, fast and low, like a tide of insects. Horns sounded, shouts cracked down the line, and then we saw them, Gallic cavalry, swarming from the eastern trees, pouring onto the ridgeline like a dam burst. Up, flank! Shields up! I bellowed, drawing my gladius as the carts buckled under the sudden charge. The line staggered, our baggage train jolted, oxen panicked. I saw a wagon topple, crushing a mule and sending amphorae of oil smashing into the dirt. Auxiliaries scrambled to form a perimeter, but the Gauls hit us like thunder. Their horses, taller, sleeker than ours, crashed down from the ridge, aiming for our exposed side. Drusus rallied the left, shouting orders and swinging his staff. I raced to the front of my century, yelling for the standard to rise. We barely had time to form up. The Gauls were on us, screaming, wild-eyed, slashing with curved blades. I took one through the neck as he rode past, his blood hot on my face. Behind me, Pullo dragged a legionary out from under a wounded mount and threw a pilum through a rider's spine. But the Germans couldn't catch them. They tried. Gods, they tried. They surged up the slope, snarling through their beards, their mounts wheezing under weight they weren't bred to carry. But the Gallic cavalry danced just out of reach, faster, longer-legged, and perfectly suited to this ground. It was like watching hounds chase stags uphill. One German fell behind, his pony collapsing beneath him, crushed under the strain. Another lost his spear in the charge, swiping at a target already gone. Drusus saw it too. "They're not fast enough," he spat. "Not like this." I didn't respond. I was too focused on the gap forming in our flank. The Germans were too slow, the Gallic riders too nimble, and in their wake came chaos. Our column, already straining under attack, now looked ready to tear open at the seams. "Shields, hold tight! Lock the wall!" I shouted. My century drew in on itself like a turtle. The shield wall slammed together, iron rims kissing iron, braced knees anchoring the line. Arrows hammered our scuta, blades sparked along the edges, but we held. The Gauls wheeled past, unable to break through us, but harassing every exposed point they could find. We couldn't last forever like this. That's when the order came. "Give your horses to the Germans." Officers dismounted without question. No time for pride. The Germanic cavalry took our reins and mounted fast, grim-faced, barbaric, perfect for what came next. They charged up the ridge. It was like watching wolves fall on deer. The Germans hit the Gallic flank with a fury even our own men feared. Spears drove deep, riders toppled. The hilltop, once in enemy hands, turned into a slaughter ground. The Gallic line buckled, then snapped. I watched them turn, panic spreading like fire. They broke. "Advance!" I roared. "Press them while they run." We surged forward. Not a full charge. We were still defending, but enough to harry their retreat, to stab and gut and drag men from saddles. By nightfall, the field was ours. 4,000 Gauls lay dead, most of them Aedui. A scout returned at dusk, his cloak torn, one side of his face streaked with blood not his own. He rode straight for the command tent, dismounted without ceremony, and saluted with clenched teeth. "Imperator," he rasped. "He's headed northwest, broke off just after sunset. No full retreat, more like a planned withdrawal. They're not scattering." Drusus and I exchanged a look. "Where?" Caesar asked, his voice low but sharp. The scout swallowed hard. "Alesia, sir. He's making for the Mandubi stronghold, high ground, fortified." A pause stretched out like a drawn bowstring. Then Caesar nodded. "Then that is where we ended." Vercingetorix vanished into the west, toward Alesia. And this time, we followed. Not as a scattered column, but as a blade drawn for the throat. For more stories, like and subscribe. Alesia, the Iron Ring. Alesia crowned a high hill, walled in stone, its flanks guarded by the Lutosa and Osera rivers, steep slopes on every side, and a wide plain stretching out before its eastern gate. No army could take it by storm, so Caesar didn't, charge. He laid siege, because that's what we do. The Greeks might have taught the world how to build walls, but Rome, we taught them how to tear them down, or outlast them. Alesia wasn't going to fall in a day. It sat on that hill like a god on a throne, rivers at its feet, cliffs on its flanks, a wall girding its heart. No legionnaire with sense would rush those heights. But we weren't there to rush. We were there to conquer. And we did what Romans do best. We organized. Sieges aren't won by heroes. They're won by trenches, by ditches, by the steady rhythm of pick and spade. That's how you break a city. Not with a blast of a horn and a charge, but with the weight of 10,000 men digging in unison, trench after trench, ditch after ditch, earth piled high into ramparts, timber hammered into palisades, fort after fort. 23 in all sprouted across the ring. It would stretch 11 Roman miles by the end, an iron belt fastened around the throat of Alesia. As I watched the lines take shape, palisade after palisade, ditch after ditch, I realized something I'd never said aloud. The Gauls had already lost. They just didn't know it yet. My century took the northern ridge, steep and cold. We worked in shifts, dig, guard, patrol, repeat. Our hands blistered, our eyes burned, our bodies sagged. But we built. Gods, we built like possessed things. Roman discipline turned us into beasts of burden and siege engineers all in one. And always, we worked beneath the eyes of the Gauls. Inside Vercingetorix watched us build his cage. Then one night, the cavalry slipped out. Gallic horsemen rode through the unfortified gaps before the ring was closed. We chased them, but it was too late. They were gone, off to summon every tribe, every last blade in Gaul. The relief army was coming. Caesar knew what that meant. He summoned us to the command tent that evening. The mood was grim. Oil lamps cast long shadows across the canvas walls. The senior legates, engineers, and centurions like myself gathered close, all of us smelling of dirt and ash, our cloaks still damp from the rain. Caesar stood over the central map table, his fingers lightly resting on the ring we had already built around Alesia. His voice was steady. Not loud, but sharp enough to cut through the murmurs. "They will come," he said. "An army from every corner of Gaul, a force great enough to break us from without, while Vercingetorix strikes from within." No one spoke. He drew a second ring in charcoal, around the first. "We will meet them here, before they reach the hill. We build again, a second wall, facing outward." I remember the look on Labienus's face. Grim approval. The engineers nodded slowly. I exchanged a glance with Drusus. He didn't speak, but his knuckles tightened on the edge of the table. We all understood what this meant. Twice the work, twice the exposure, but also the one chance we had to choke the rebellion for good. "Discipline will win this siege," Caesar said. "Not valor, not gods, trenches, walls, and order, the way Rome conquers." And just like that, the second ring was born. Not in earth, but in the mind of the one man who never wavered. We filed out in silence. By dawn, every hand had a tool, every camp had its orders. We built another ring, an outer line of defense facing the world, a second wall against a second army, 17 kilometers of fortifications, 3 rows of ditches, the inner filled with water. The earthworks rose nearly 4 meters high. Towers every 80 feet, rows of sharpened stakes, caltropes, buried blades. We made the very soil bleed, and then they came. Pachomius of the Atrebates brought them, a horde on the horizon, tens of thousands, infantry in the hills, cavalry on the plains. From the heights of Alesia, Vercingetorix saw them arrive. They cheered. We braced. The first assault came swift. It began with a low horn blast from the eastern hills, and then they were there, wave after wave of Gauls pouring across the plain. From outside the siege ring, they stormed our outer defenses, trying to overwhelm our towers. At the same time, Vercingetorix unleashed his warriors from within, filling the trenches with earth and brushwood to mount a charge against our inner line. The first assault came swift. It began with a low horn blast from the eastern hills, and then they were there, wave after wave of Gauls pouring across the plain. From outside the siege ring, they stormed our outer defenses, trying to overwhelm our towers. At the same time, Vercingetorix unleashed his warriors from within, filling the trenches with earth and brushwood to mount a charge against our inner line. They screamed, they climbed, they died. Gods, how they died! But they kept coming. Inside the city, the defenders surged forward, trying to breach the inner line. Their cries rose with the clash of blades, a cacophony of fury and desperation. The trap was closing, but not on us. We fought like wolves, shoulder to shoulder, mud up to our knees, blood on our boots, and we held the line. The next day was quiet, too quiet. It made the men nervous. I could see it in the way Pullo cleaned his armor twice before midday, in how Lupus checked the scorpion mounts again and again without speaking. Even Drusus, steady as granite, stood a little too long at the edge of the palisade, watching the darkened tree line. Then just after the third watch bell, the horns sounded. They came with everything: ladders, hooks, siege tools cobbled from wood and desperation. They screamed as they charged, voices wild in the dark. The firelight caught their blades, like flame off water. We were already at the wall. I barked orders through the smoke. Drusus relayed commands like a machine. The air stank of pitch and blood. Crispus was the first to fall, took a javelin through the thigh, then a second in the shoulder. He didn't cry out, just sank to his knees. Mercus, Lupus, and Pullo fought like men possessed. Lupus lost a tooth in a headbutt and kept laughing between swings. Pullo climbed the siege ladder just to hurl the Gauls back down from the top. They died in droves. By torchlight, we held. Shields locked, backs braced. Blood ran into the ditches until the ground was slick as a butcher's floor. My arms burned. My voice cracked. But the line never broke. We stood in the dark, and we endured. But the worst came at dawn. They found the weak point. A stretch of wall on the plain, poorly placed, not yet reinforced. 60,000 Gauls under a chieftain named Vercingetorix slammed into it. Only 2 legions held the line, my century among them. We broke, almost. We fought on platforms, shoulder to shoulder. I saw Lupus vanish under a wave of shields. Pullo pulled him out, half dead. Drusus took an arrow to the ribs and kept fighting. Caesar arrived. He came himself. Red cloak over his shoulders, sword in hand. No guards, no ceremony, just presence. Through the crush of smoke and screams, I saw him rise on the slope like something from myth. More than a man. His boots hit the earth like war drums. There was blood on his greaves, the eyes of the gods in his face. The men saw him and stood taller. I did. Pullo, barely standing, bared his teeth and raised his shield again. Lupus, his arm bloodied to the elbow, grinned like a wolf. Drusus nodded once, grim and sure, as if the general's arrival was always part of his plan. Caesar lifted one arm, just one. The signal. A horn blast tore through the chaos. A deep commanding note that echoed across the plain, like the voice of Mars himself. Every man knew what it meant. Ibyipullo, barely standing, bared his teeth and raised his shield again. Lupus, his arm bloodied to the elbow, grinned like a wolf. Drusus nodded once, grim and sure, as if the general's arrival was always part of his plan. Caesar lifted one arm, just one. The signal. A horn blast tore through the chaos. A deep commanding note that echoed across the plain like the voice of Mars himself. Every man knew what it meant. From behind the ridges, the reserves surged, fresh cohorts roaring into the fray, standards lifted high, Pila bristling like a wall of death. The sound of marching feet met the chaos like thunder answering lightning. And then, the trap was sprung. Cohorts Caesar had hidden in reserve burst out of the thickets and folds behind the Gallic assault. They slammed into the enemy like an avalanche of bronze and discipline. The Gauls faltered. They turned. Confusion rippled across their lines like cracks in ice. Then came panic. It was beautiful. The moment the battle was won. Not because we killed them all, but because they knew. They saw him, they saw us, and they broke. By midnight, the Roman cavalry had chased the rest into the dark. Few would see their homes again. And in the morning a new silence settled. Envoys came to the gates, wrapped in cloaks, their faces hollow with sleeplessness and defeat. They asked for parley. A hush fell over the walls. The battle was over. Though some of the Gauls still clutched weapons, their hands shook with hunger, not resolve. They sent word to Caesar. We were gathered by the outer camp when the message came. Officers, veterans, standard bearers. The air was raw, heavy with the smoke of wet wood and pyres still smoldering. The dirt was thick with the smell of blood and pitch, the kind of cold that clung to your bones even under a boiled wool cloak. Caesar stood tall beneath the folds of his crimson cloak, flanked by silence more than guards. When he read the scroll, he didn't smile. He didn't frown. He simply nodded. A gesture so small, but it felt like the hill itself bowed with it. Word spread fast, like flame caught in dry grass. The war chief would surrender, and so we assembled. The whole army. Men bruised and bandaged, streaked with ash and sweat. Cohorts in formation, centurions like statues, even the wounded propped up to bear witness. It wasn't just a surrender. It was the end of something vast. Caesar took his seat atop a wooden tribunal built the night before, as if he'd known this moment would come. The gates of Alesia creaked open, and there he was, Vercingetorix. He rode alone, no escort, no banners, just a man and a horse moving through the smoke of his own defeat. His armor gleamed, clean, polished, ceremonial, but he looked like a man already laid to rest. Proud, silent, broken only by the weight of inevitability. I'll never forget that moment. He dismounted before Caesar, slow and sure, removed his sword with both hands, holding it flat like an offering. Then he knelt. No speeches, no plea, just surrender. A king no longer, just a prisoner. The war for Gaul was over, but the memory of Alesia, that ring of earth and fire, that would never fade. For more stories, like and subscribe.